Why was she shaking when she opened the safe? Maybe it was grief, or maybe, deep down, she already knew something wasn't right. The letter had arrived that morning, an official-looking envelope with the seal of the U.S. Army printed neatly in the corner. Sarah Martinez had stared at it for a long time before opening it. It wasn't that she didn't understand what it might say. She just wasn't ready to face what it meant. The words inside blurred through her tears, but the message was unmistakable. Please return all military equipment belonging to Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez within 7 days. Her late husband's name. Her husband's rifle. Her husband's world that had ended, and yet somehow still pulled her toward it. It had been 3 months since Miguel's death in Afghanistan. The word "killed in action" had been printed on the notice like a stamp, cold and bureaucratic. She buried him with military honors, folded the flag herself, and stood straight while others wept. But inside, she'd never really left that moment. And now they wanted his things back. The study smelled like him, aftershave, coffee, gun oil. The small room had become her sanctuary and her prison all at once. Every object, every photograph, every medal carried his presence. His handwriting on old deployment notes. His uniform perfectly pressed. The medals he never liked displaying because, as he once said, "You don't wear bravery, you just live it." Sarah's hand hovered near the locked gun safe in the corner. She had never opened it herself. Miguel always took care of the weapons, cleaning them, checking them, logging their maintenance like a ritual. But the letter had given her no choice. The army wanted the rifle. She wiped her eyes, punched in the combination, their wedding date, and the lock clicked open with a soft metallic sigh. Inside lay Miguel's M4 carbine, gleaming as though it had been waiting for his hands. The weapon was clean, oiled, and ready, like a soldier still waiting for orders that would never come. Her fingers trembled as she reached in and brushed against something unexpected. A small envelope taped to the inside of the safe door. Her name written in Miguel's handwriting. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. She peeled the yellowed tape away, the edges crumbling in her hands. The envelope had clearly been there for months, maybe years. Inside was a letter dated 2 weeks before Miguel's final deployment. Her husband's voice filled her mind as she read. "My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, it means something happened to me. There are things I couldn't tell you while I was alive, because they would have put you in danger." The words blurred. Sarah pressed her hand to her mouth, reading on. Miguel had written about an illegal weapons operation, about officers moving American weapons to unauthorized buyers, guns that were supposed to be destroyed or logged as lost. He had stumbled onto evidence, names, transactions, photos. He'd been gathering proof. He wrote, "I've hidden copies of the documents and recordings in a place only you would think to look, the old coffee tin behind the winter coats in our bedroom closet. You remember that one, don't you? The emergency fund from when we were broke newlyweds." Sarah's heartbeat thudded in her ears. "If something happens to me, be careful. These people have too much to lose, but don't let them bury the truth, Sarah. I couldn't live with it. Maybe you'll have to." When she finished reading, Sarah just sat there frozen. The letter felt heavier than any weapon in the safe. Miguel had known. He'd known he was being watched, that he was getting close to something dangerous. And now that danger had crossed into her quiet home. A car door slammed outside. Sarah's head jerked up. Through the window, a black sedan had parked in her driveway. 2 men stepped out, not in uniform, but their posture was unmistakable. Military, confident, controlled. Her heart pounded as they walked to the door. She slipped the letter into her pocket, shut the safe, and forced her breathing to slow. The doorbell rang. Once, twice. Sarah peered through the peephole. One man was tall and thin, graying at the temples. The other was broader, his jaw tight, eyes scanning the porch. They looked calm, too calm. She unlocked the door chain, just enough to open a small gap. "Can I help you?" Her voice sounded steadier than she felt. The older man smiled politely. "Mrs. Martinez, I'm Colonel Davidson. This is Major Thompson. We're here about your husband's equipment. We understand you received a letter this morning. We'd like to help expedite the process." Something about the word expedite made her uneasy. "The letter said I have 7 days," Sarah replied. "I haven't even started yet. It's still difficult." The colonel nodded with practiced sympathy. "Of course, we understand your grief, but there's been a change in procedure. We need to collect Sergeant Martinez's rifle immediately. There's been an inventory discrepancy." Sarah frowned. "An inventory discrepancy?" "It's just a routine check," the younger one, Thompson, added smoothly. "We'll have it back to you in a few hours." Her mind replayed Miguel's warning. They won't hesitate to silence anyone who threatens them. She glanced toward the gun safe, still locked, then back to the men. "I'd prefer to follow the written instructions," she said carefully. "If there's really a change in procedure, you can provide written confirmation." The smile on Davidson's face tightened. "Mrs. Martinez, I don't think you understand the urgency. We're not asking for everything, just the rifle. Surely you can cooperate." Miguel's letter burned like fire in her pocket. These people have too much to lose. Sarah steadied her breath. "Miguel never mentioned either of you." A flicker of irritation crossed the colonel's face. "Your husband worked with many divisions, Mrs. Martinez. You wouldn't know all of them." The tone had shifted, authority, not sympathy. And then the threat came, quiet, controlled. "Cooperation now could help us. Ensure your husband's record remains untarnished," Davidson said, "and that your widow's benefits remain unaffected." Sarah froze. Her chest tightened, rage simmering under the fear. "You're threatening me," she said softly, "in my own home." Major Thompson took a small step closer. His jacket shifted, revealing the faint outline of a shoulder holster. "No one's threatening you, ma'am," he said flatly. "But this situation could get complicated if you don't cooperate." Sarah's mind raced. She could give them the rifle, and maybe disappear quietly after that. Or she could trust Miguel, trust that whatever he'd found was worth risking everything for. "I'd like to see your identification," she said suddenly. Davidson blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me." "Military ID," Sarah repeated. "If you're here on official business, you'll have it." The colonel hesitated. His hand went to his pocket, but Sarah noticed it trembled. He pulled out a wallet, flipped it open, and held it near the door gap. It looked official at first glance. But the unit designation didn't match anything Miguel had ever mentioned. The logo looked too new. And something about the plastic, too pristine. "This doesn't look right," Sarah said, backing away. "You should leave." Thompson's eyes hardened. "Mrs. Martinez, open this door." "I'm calling the base commander," she said, and slammed the door shut, locking the chain. Her hands shook as she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. Outside, footsteps scraped the porch, a low murmur between the two men. Then, the sound of the doorknob turning. 911, what's your emergency?" "This is Sarah Martinez, Fort Carson housing area," she said quickly. "2 men are at my door pretending to be military officers. They're threatening me." The operator's tone sharpened. "Stay on the line, ma'am. Police are on the way." The men tested the windows. She could hear the crunch of gravel, the creak of wood, then the slam of car doors. She ran to the window. The black sedan was speeding off, tires screaming against the asphalt. Sarah's knees gave out. The phone slipped from her hand as relief and terror crashed together inside her. The police came and went. They took her statement, promised to patrol, but Sarah could tell from their eyes they didn't believe her. To them, she was a grieving widow seeing ghosts. But ghosts didn't drive black sedans. When the house was quiet again, she went to the bedroom, locked the door, and pulled open the closet. Miguel's uniforms hung perfectly pressed, his boots aligned like soldiers waiting for inspection. Behind the heavy winter coats her hand found it, the old coffee tin, the one Miguel had mentioned. She sat on the bed, opened it. Inside were dozens of photographs, flash drives, printed documents, recordings. And in one of the photographs, Colonel Davidson, shaking hands with a man beside a truck filled with unmarked crates. The timestamp, 2 months before Miguel's death. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. He hadn't just suspected corruption, he had proof. And those men hadn't come for a rifle. They'd come to erase what was left of him. Her phone rang again, making her flinch. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Martinez," a calm voice said. "My name is David Chen. I was a friend of your husband's. We served together. And I think you just had visitors, people who shouldn't have known where you live." Sarah's pulse spiked. "Who are you?" "I'll explain everything, but first you need to leave your house, right now." The line clicked, silence. Sarah stared at her reflection in the dark window. Her hand brushed against the rifle case, the one Miguel had cleaned, oiled, and left behind. She didn't know it yet, but the moment she grabbed it, her life would change forever. How do you pack your life in 10 minutes? Sarah stood in the dark, the letter still in her pocket, Miguel's rifle lying across the bed. Every instinct told her not to move, and yet something deeper told her she couldn't stay. The headlights that had flashed through her window earlier weren't random. Someone had been watching the house. Her hands moved automatically, Miguel's laptop, the coffee tin of evidence, spare clothes, her car keys. And the rifle, always the rifle. But she hesitated. Leaving meant running. Running meant accepting that the people who killed Miguel were now hunting her. Her phone buzzed again, same number as before. She answered cautiously, "Who is this?" The voice was calm, precise. "David Chen. I know you don't trust me yet, but your husband did. He left instructions in case something happened." "How do I know that's true?" There was a pause, then Chen said softly, "He told me to remind you about the promise you made on your second anniversary, Rocky Mountain National Park. That you would always tell each other the truth, no matter how hard it was." The words hit like a whisper from the dead. That night had been theirs, cold stars, the smell of pine, Miguel's laughter. It wasn't something anyone else could have known. Sarah swallowed hard. "You said I need to leave. Why?" "Because they'll be back," Chen said. "And next time they won't knock. They think you have the rifle. If they find you, they'll kill you to make sure whatever your husband uncovered dies with him." Her grip tightened on the phone. "Where do I go?" "There's a diner 10 miles south Mel's off Highway 115. Old neon sign, open 24 hours. Bring the rifle, and only what you can carry. Don't use your car, they'll be watching it. You have 1 hour." The call ended. For a few seconds, Sarah just stood there numb. Then something inside her shifted. The woman who had spent 3 months drowning in grief suddenly began to move with clarity. Grief had made her still, fear made her careful, but now she was angry. She stuffed Miguel's rifle into a gym bag, added copies of the most important documents from the coffee tin, and hid the rest inside an old sewing machine in the basement. If they found her, at least the truth would survive. The neighborhood was quiet as she slipped out through the back door. Her heart hammered in her ears. The streetlights painted long shadows on the empty road. She moved quickly, staying in the dark. Her neighbors were gone, an elderly couple she'd known for years. Their garage door stuck slightly when pulled, just as she remembered. Inside sat their old pickup truck, keys hidden under the garden gnome, a detail Miguel had once laughed about. Sarah left a short note on the counter, "Borrowing the truck for an emergency. I'll bring it back. Sarah." The truck started with a reluctant cough. Its headlights stayed off until she turned onto the main road. She drove with her hands tight on the wheel, watching every mirror. The world outside seemed too quiet. Every passing car felt like a shadow tailing her. But when the neon glow of Mel's diner appeared in the distance, blue, flickering, like an oasis, she exhaled for the first time in an hour. The parking lot was nearly empty. Just a semi parked near the far end, its driver asleep inside. Sarah parked behind the diner out of sight and entered through the back door. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee and frying bacon filled the air. The waitress behind the counter barely looked up. Only one customer sat in the corner booth, an Asian man in his 40s, gray sweater, jeans, eyes that carried the weight of too many secrets. He stood when he saw her. "Mrs. Martinez," he said softly, "thank you for coming." Sarah didn't sit right away. She kept the gym bag close. "You said you knew my husband." Chen nodded. "We worked together. Not officially, he came to me when he found irregularities in the weapons inventory. I'm with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office. We investigate corruption inside the military." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "You expect me to just believe that?" Chen reached into his jacket, slow, deliberate, and placed two items on the table, an official badge and a digital recorder. "Miguel gave me this before his final deployment," he said. "He told me, if I don't make it back, play this for her." Sarah hesitated, then pressed play. And then she heard it. His voice. Miguel's voice, warm, steady, alive. "Sarah, if you're hearing this, then I didn't come home. I want you to know I wasn't killed in some random ambush. I was silenced because I found something I wasn't supposed to." Her hands shook. The diner disappeared around her. It was just his voice pulling her through the dark. "I've hidden evidence, everything they need to bring these people down. The rifle has the last piece. In the stock, there's a hidden compartment with a micro SD card. Bank account, transfers, photos, names. Everything. You need to trust David Chen. He's the only one I told. Be careful, me Ammer. They will come for you, but if you're brave, we can still win." The recording ended. The silence afterward was unbearable. Sarah pressed her hands over her face, her breath catching somewhere between a sob and a gasp. When she looked up, Chen's expression was steady. "Do you have the rifle?" She unzipped the gym bag and slid it toward him. He worked with precision, checking the weapon, his fingers tracing the stock until he found the faint seam Miguel had described. A click, a tiny panel slid open. Inside, a micro SD card, smaller than a fingernail. Chen sealed it in a plastic evidence sleeve. "This is what your husband died for." Sarah stared at the rifle, her throat tightening. "It's what they came to my house for." Chen nodded grimly. "And it's what will bring them down." But Sarah's fear was giving way to something else now, resolve. What happens next? "We verify the data, coordinate arrests, but we have to be careful. This corruption runs deep. Even in my office, I can't trust everyone." He looked toward the window. "You can't go home. You'll stay at a safe house tonight. After that, we'll move fast." Sarah's grip tightened on Miguel's dog tags hanging around her neck. "How deep does this go?" Chen's jaw tightened. "High, very high. 2 generals, multiple colonels, civilian contractors, all making millions selling U.S. weapons to foreign buyers." "And Miguel," she asked quietly, "he died because of it?" "Yes." His voice was steady, but his eyes carried guilt. "Someone in his unit sold his patrol route. They arranged the attack to look like a random IED, but it wasn't random at all." Her stomach turned. He'd been betrayed by someone he trusted. Chen leaned closer. "But now we have what we need to prove it. That micro card is the missing piece." A car's headlights swept across the diner's windows. Both of them froze, but it was only a trucker pulling in for coffee. Still, Chen checked his watch. We should go. Outside, the night was cold. Sarah followed him to a nondescript gray sedan parked behind the diner. The drive took them deep into the mountains, winding roads, dark forests, moonlight flickering through the pines. When they finally stopped, Sarah saw a cabin tucked into the hillside, almost invisible from the road. Chen motioned for her to follow. This is a safe house. 2 agents are waiting inside. The door opened before they knocked. A woman in her 30s, sharp eyes, calm presence extended her hand. Agent Rebecca Walsh, FBI liaison, you must be Mrs. Martinez. Behind her, a tall, weathered man nodded. Agent Marcus Rodriguez, we've been waiting for you. The cabin felt both secure and claustrophobic. Maps pinned to the walls, laptops humming, radios crackling softly. Sarah sat at the kitchen table while Chen inserted the SD card into a laptop. The screen filled with folders, hundreds of them. Bank transfers, shipping manifests, emails, photographs. Rodriguez whistled low. Damn, this is enough to bring down half the command structure. Walsh leaned closer, her tone clipped. This goes straight to the top. 2 generals, several colonels, and civilian contractors. They were selling U.S. weapons and laundering the profits through shell companies overseas. Sarah looked at the screen. Photos of crates, serial numbers, even faces she recognized from Miguel's photos. This is why he died, she whispered. Walsh placed a hand on her shoulder. And this is how we make it matter. Hours passed as the agents cross-referenced files and compiled lists. The conspiracy's reach was staggering, spanning 4 states, millions of dollars, and years of corruption. Sarah could barely process it all, but somewhere amid the exhaustion, she felt something unexpected: purpose. By dawn, they had a plan: simultaneous arrests across multiple states. Military police, FBI, and the Inspector General's office would move together. If it worked, it would shatter the network overnight. Chen turned to Sarah. When this is over, they'll know your husband's name for what it really stands for: integrity. But Sarah wasn't smiling. And if it doesn't work? He met her eyes. Then they'll come for us. Outside, the first light crept over the mountains. For the first time since Miguel's death, Sarah didn't feel lost. She felt ready. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that before sunset, their safe house would be surrounded. And the war her husband had died fighting would find her again. The first thing Sarah noticed when she woke was the silence. Not the comforting kind, the hollow, ringing quiet that follows chaos. A thin ray of dawn leaked through the blinds of a military infirmary window. Her shoulder throbbed from bruises she didn't remember getting. The antiseptic smell told her she was still alive and still protected. Barely. Across the small room, David Chen sat in a plastic chair, a coffee gone cold in his hand. His clothes were rumpled, his face unshaven. He looked like a man who hadn't slept in days. When he saw her eyes open, relief crossed his face, quickly replaced by the weary caution of someone who knew the fight wasn't over. You're safe, he said softly, for now. Sarah tried to sit up. Where are we? Fort Carson. The same base whose letter had started everything. He hesitated before adding, Agent Walsh made it. A shoulder wound, nothing fatal. Rodriguez. The rest didn't need words. The ache in Chen's voice said enough. Sarah stared at the sterile wall. He stayed behind. He bought us time. Chen's jaw clenched, and because of that, the evidence survived. Through the window, she could see movement: soldiers patrolling the perimeter, armored vehicles positioned at checkpoints. The base had turned itself into a fortress overnight. Somewhere inside, men and women in uniforms were staring at screens filled with names, wire transfers, and photos. The proof Miguel had died to gather. 17 arrests so far, Chen continued. 2 colonels, a general, 12 contractors, and 3 civilian brokers. But the main players, Davidson, Harrison, and Peterson, are still out there. Sarah swallowed. They know I'm alive. Yes, which means they'll try again, but now the world is watching. He handed her a small envelope. Inside was a folded letter, her handwriting, copied from Miguel's old deployment forms. A decoy signature, part of a security protocol that now bore her name. "You're under federal protection," he said. "New identity, restricted movement. You'll testify once the indictments are formal. Until then, you stay on base." Sarah nodded numbly, but inside she felt the war wasn't done. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the flash of the safe house gunfire, the smoke, the shout, Rodriguez's last burst of covering fire. Guilt clawed at her ribs. Another man died because of Miguel's truth. Later that afternoon, General Patricia Morrison arrived. Silver hair, sharp eyes, the authority of someone who'd commanded battlefields and boardrooms alike. She entered the room with 2 MPs and a folder marked classified. "Mrs. Martinez," she began, voice even but not cold, "your husband's investigation was more thorough than any of us imagined. What he exposed," she laid the folder on the table, "goes straight to the top." She opened it. Photos, bank statements, copies of recorded calls. And one image Sarah recognized instantly, Davidson, shaking hands beside the crate-filled truck. Morrison continued. Over 4 years, this network sold more than 10,000 U.S. weapons, rifles, grenades, even anti-tank missiles. Profits exceeding $50 million. Some of those weapons turned up in insurgent attacks against our own troops. Sarah felt her stomach twist. American weapons, killing American soldiers. "Yes," Morrison's eyes softened briefly, "including your husband's unit." The words landed like a knife. Chen leaned forward. "We've traced internal communications. Someone inside Miguel's squad, Sergeant Marcus Thompson, leaked his patrol route. He confessed this morning after arrest. He was paid to make sure Miguel's convoy passed a specific checkpoint where an IED was waiting." Sarah froze. "Thompson, he was one of Miguel's friends." "Not anymore," Morrison said quietly. "He'll spend the rest of his life in prison." The room fell silent, except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Sarah looked down at her hands. "What do you do," she whispered, "when justice feels heavier than grief?" No one answered. They didn't have to. The following days blurred together, debriefings, statements, polygraphs. News broke nationwide. Massive weapons trafficking ring uncovered, dozens arrested. They called it Operation Iron Veil. Reporters camped outside the gates. Every headline used Miguel's name. To the world, Sarah had become the widow who wouldn't stay silent. But inside the base, the quiet war continued. Davidson and Harrison were still missing. And the agents feared they weren't running, they were regrouping. At night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She'd walk to the base museum where they had temporarily stored Miguel's rifle in an evidence case. Even through glass, it carried presence as if Miguel still guarded it. She rest her hand on the cold surface and whisper, "We're not done yet, are we?" One evening, she found Chen standing there too. He looked older than before, shoulders heavier. "They're planning the final arrests tomorrow," he said. "Harrison was spotted near the Mexican border. Davidson's using false passports. They're running out of money, but men like that don't surrender, they bargain." "Then we finish it," Sarah said simply. He looked at her, really looked. "You've changed." She almost smiled. "So have you." He nodded. "Courage does that." The next morning came like thunder. Before sunrise, the command center buzzed with motion, screens flashing, radios chattering. Sarah watched from a corner of the operations room as Morrison's voice cut through the noise. "All units execute Phase Delta. Go loud at 600 Eastern." Across the country, coordinated raids began, Colorado, Virginia, California, Miami, even overseas. Dozens of agents moved at once, kicking down doors, seizing servers, handcuffing men who once thought themselves untouchable. By 700, reports flooded in. 27 arrests, millions seized, assets frozen. Cheers erupted in the room, brief, cautious, like soldiers exhaling after holding their breath too long. Then Rodriguez's photo flashed on the main screen, a tribute slide. Morrison's voice softened. He gave his life for this. Let's make sure it meant something. Sarah closed her eyes, whispering, "It did." But victory never comes without echoes. At 7:15, a message arrived from the D.C. field office. General Harrison missing. Davidson unaccounted for. Minutes later, another alert. An unauthorized signal pinged near Fort Carson's outer perimeter. Chen's head snapped up. That's too close. Morrison turned to her security detail. Lock down the base. Sirens wailed across the compound, red lights flashing like heartbeat alarms. Through the window, Sarah saw MPs rushing to barricades. Helicopters circled overhead. Then an explosion in the distance. Not large, but close enough to rattle the glass. "They found us again," Chen muttered. "How the hell?" Morrison's eyes narrowed. "We have a leak inside our investigation." The radio crackled. Unidentified vehicle breached outer gate, engaged by security. Chen grabbed his sidearm. "Stay here, Mrs. Martinez." But Sarah shook her head. "No, not again. I'm not hiding while someone else dies for him." Before he could argue, the door burst open, 2 MPs ushering in a handcuffed man. Blood on his temple. "Marcus Thompson." Morrison's voice was ice. "How did he get out?" One MP answered. "He escaped during transport, ma'am. Said he wanted to make it right." Thompson looked up at Sarah, eyes hollow. "They're coming for you, Davidson's men, ex-contractors. I heard them talking. They said if the widow lives, everything burns." Sarah stared, torn between rage and pity. "Why tell us now?" He swallowed hard. "Because Miguel didn't deserve what I did to him, and neither do you." Morrison motioned to take him away. "Get him to the brig, double the guard." Outside, gunfire echoed faintly in the distance, short bursts, then silence. An MP's voice over radio confirmed, vehicle neutralized, 2 assailants down, no further threats detected. The tension bled from the room like air from a lung. Chen holstered his weapon, turning toward Sarah. "It's over." But Sarah wasn't sure. She'd seen enough to know that evil didn't end with one headline. It hid. It waited. Still, when Morrison approached her hours later with a soft smile, Sarah let herself breathe. "Mrs. Martinez," the general said, "the president has approved posthumous honors for your husband. Distinguished Service Cross. His courage exposed something that could have destroyed lives around the world." Sarah's throat tightened. "He just wanted to do the right thing." "And so did you," Morrison said. "Sometimes that's rarer." Weeks later, the courtroom smelled of old paper and tension. Sarah sat behind the witness stand, facing rows of cameras and curious faces. Colonel Davidson, captured in Brazil, stood before her, thinner, colder. He refused to look at her. That was fine. She wanted him to hear her instead. She told them everything. The letter, the fake officers, the coffee tin, the rifle. Each word felt like peeling away another layer of fear. When it was over, the prosecutor asked, "Mrs. Martinez, why did you risk your life for this?" Sarah's answer was simple. "Because silence lets men like him win." Months later, Fort Carson held a ceremony in the same courtyard where she had once wept over a folded flag. The air was clear, the sky a bright Colorado blue. General Morrison pinned the medal to a velvet box and handed it to her. The crowd stood in silence. "Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez," Morrison said, voice steady, "gave his life not only for his country but for its conscience." Sarah accepted the medal, feeling its weight not as honor but as truth made tangible. When reporters asked how she felt, She didn't give them sound bites. She simply said, he believed integrity was a weapon. He was right. That evening, she visited the base museum. Behind the glass, Miguel's rifle rested on a polished stand, the plaque reading, "The weapon that ended Operation Iron Veil." She placed her hand against the glass. The reflection staring back wasn't the grieving widow from months ago. It was someone tempered, scarred, but whole. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. And somewhere in that stillness, she felt Miguel's voice again, calm and proud. "You finished what we started, me Amber." They called it justice, but to Sarah, it felt more like gravity, a slow, unstoppable pull that dragged everything into the open. 6 months had passed since the ceremony at Fort Carson. Snow had begun to dust the Rockies, and the air carried the sharp bite of winter mornings. The world had moved on. Headlines had faded, the networks found new scandals to chase, and the talking heads on TV had already turned Miguel Martinez into a story, one more tale of valor and betrayal. But for Sarah, the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Every morning she woke to the same silence, the same ache that never really left. But now she filled that silence with purpose. Her days began with briefings, phone calls, meetings with prosecutors, interviews with defense attorneys who looked at her like she was a storm they didn't know how to predict. She was no longer a widow grieving in the shadows. She was a witness, a key figure, and unintentionally a symbol. The courtroom in Denver was packed on the first day of the trial. Federal agents, reporters, cameras lined along the back wall. And in the front row, Sarah sat with her hands folded tightly, the same wedding ring still on her finger. When they brought in Colonel Davidson, the room seemed to contract. He was thinner than she remembered, his arrogance dulled by months of confinement. His orange prison jumpsuit looked alien on the man who once stood on her porch with a predator's calm. Now he was just another man who'd mistaken greed for invincibility. The judge's gavel struck, the air stilled. The prosecution presented their evidence, Miguel's files, Chen's testimonies, the recordings. Each clip, each photograph, another nail in the coffin of corruption. When Sarah was called to the stand, the world fell silent. The lawyer's questions were steady but kind. He asked about the letter, the coffee tin, the rifle. She told them everything, the smell of gun oil and aftershave, the envelope taped to the safe, the words that changed her life. Her voice shook once, just once, when she described the men at her door. Then came the defense. They tried to paint her as emotional, unstable, a grieving widow misled by circumstance. She met every question with a quiet strength that silenced the whispers. "No," she said evenly. "I wasn't led, I was warned, and I listened." At one point, the defense attorney leaned forward and said, almost condescendingly, "Mrs. Martinez, do you really expect this court to believe you uncovered a military conspiracy on your own?" Sarah didn't flinch. "No," she said softly. "My husband did. I just refused to bury him twice." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Even the judge paused before continuing. When she stepped down from the witness stand, Chen gave her a small nod from the gallery, proud, exhausted. He'd carried his own ghost through this, and she could see the toll it had taken. The trial lasted 8 weeks. By the end, the truth was undeniable. General Harrison, life without parole. Colonel Davidson, 35 years for conspiracy, trafficking, and obstruction. Sergeant Marcus Thompson, 25 years, reduced for cooperation. Dozens more sentenced across states and continents. The courtroom gasped when the verdicts were read, but Sarah didn't. She only exhaled slowly, deliberately, as though letting go of a weight she'd carried since the day the letter arrived. When it was over, reporters crowded outside the courthouse. Microphones, cameras, flashes, each one demanding a sound bite, a headline. A journalist shouted, Mrs. Martinez, how does it feel to finally have justice? Sarah stopped at the courthouse steps. She thought about Miguel's laughter, about Rodriguez's sacrifice, about Agent Walsh recovering from her wounds, about the faces of soldiers who never made it home. Then she said quietly, "It doesn't feel like justice. It feels like the truth, and that's heavier." In the months that followed, Sarah's life became a patchwork of interviews, foundations, and invitations she never asked for. People wanted her story. Publishers wanted a book. Networks wanted a documentary. At first, she refused. She didn't want her husband's death turned into a brand. But Chen convinced her otherwise. "If you don't tell it," he said, "someone else will, and they'll get it wrong." So she told it carefully, truthfully. Not to glorify pain, but to warn against it. The book was called Honor in Silence. It wasn't about bullets or conspiracies. It was about integrity and what it costs to keep it. It sold quietly at first, then spread through military families, through veterans groups, through the halls of Congress where people quoted her husband's final words. Soon, Sarah found herself on stages she'd never imagined, speaking to audiences who listened not because she was famous, but because she was real. The foundation came next. The Martinez Integrity Fund. She built it from the royalties and speaking engagements, channeling the money into programs for military families, whistleblower protection, and oversight reforms. It wasn't glamorous work. It was bureaucratic, slow, filled with meetings and compromise, but it mattered. She learned to navigate the system that had once tried to silence her. Every form signed, every policy updated, felt like reclaiming ground that Miguel had fought for. Chen became her closest ally, a friend forged through shared battle. He'd returned to Washington but called weekly, sending updates on ongoing reforms, investigations, progress that no one saw on TV. He sounded tired but lighter, as if redemption in small doses was enough to keep him going. One night months later, Sarah sat alone in her kitchen, staring at a letter addressed to Mrs. Sarah Martinez, founder, Martinez Integrity Fund. The letter was from a young private stationed in Iraq. It read, "Ma'am, my unit found crates marked destroyed that were still active. We reported it because of your story. I thought you should know we stopped a bad shipment. Tell Sergeant Martinez his sacrifice still saves lives." Sarah pressed the paper to her chest and wept quietly, freely, for the first time in months. Not from grief, but from something deeper. Proof that courage echoes. Years passed. The world remembered Operation Iron Veil as a historical event, a cautionary tale. Students wrote papers about it. Cadets learned about it in ethics training. And somewhere in Colorado Springs, a small museum exhibit told the story through photos, letters, and one rifle in a glass case. Every year, on the anniversary of Miguel's death, Sarah visited that exhibit alone. She'd stand in front of the display, her hand pressed to the glass where the rifle rested, the same one that had carried the truth inside its stock. The plaque beneath it read, "Integrity is the highest form of defense." Visitors would walk by, unaware that the quiet woman standing there was the reason that rifle was behind glass and not in a desert halfway around the world. Sometimes she'd whisper to it, "We did it." And sometimes she'd just stand there, letting the silence speak for both of them. But even peace has ghosts. One evening, long after closing hours, Sarah found herself sitting in that museum again. The curator had let her in after hours. The lights were dim, the hall empty. Outside, snow began to fall softly, covering the parade ground in white. She sat on a bench, looking at the rifle's reflection in the glass. "You know," a familiar voice said from behind her, "most people visit museums to see history, not to talk to it." She turned. David Chen, older now, stood in the doorway, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I didn't expect to see you," she said. "Washington sent me west again," he replied. "Old cases, new questions, thought I'd stop by." He joined her on the bench, the silence between them comfortable. For a long moment, they just watched the snow fall beyond the window. "You ever wonder," he said finally, "if any of this actually changed things?" Sarah smiled faintly. "It changed me. And that's enough." She considered it. Maybe that's where change starts. Chen nodded slowly. Miguel would have liked that answer. "He would have argued first," she said, smiling. "Then he would have agreed." They sat there for another hour trading stories, not about the operation, not about politics or betrayal, but about small human things. The way Miguel used to whistle when he cleaned his gear. The way Rodriguez always drank terrible instant coffee, but swore it kept him alive. The way Agent Walsh sent postcards from every city she worked in after recovery, each one ending with the same line, "Still fighting." When Chen finally stood to leave, he placed a small box on the bench beside her. Inside was Rodriguez's service pin, recovered from the ruins of the safe house. "He would have wanted you to have it," Chen said quietly. Sarah closed the box carefully, her throat tight. "Thank you." He hesitated at the door. "Sarah," he said, "do you ever think about what might have happened if you just returned the rifle, if you never opened the safe?" She looked back at the display case, the faint reflection of Miguel's rifle glinting under soft museum light. "Yes," she said, "sometimes. And every time I do, I remember what silence costs." Chen nodded once, the kind of nod soldiers give each other before walking away from something sacred. Then he was gone. Outside, the snow had thickened. The museum lights cast long beams across the white ground, soft and quiet. Sarah lingered a moment longer, her reflection merging with the rifle in the glass. She reached out, fingertips touching the cold surface. It felt like holding his hand through time. Somewhere deep inside, she still heard his voice, steady, calm, unafraid. "If you ever doubt yourself, remember, courage isn't loud. It's the quiet that refuses to die." She smiled, whispering, "Then we're still alive, Miguel." And as the snow fell, covering the parade ground of Fort Carson, the rifle behind the glass caught the light, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Sometimes victory doesn't roar. It just endures. There are two kinds of wars. The ones fought with rifles, and the ones fought with memory. For Sarah Martinez, the second kind lasted longer. 2 years had passed since the last gavel fell, since the headlines faded from the front pages. The Martinez Integrity Fund had grown beyond anything she imagined. Offices in Denver and D.C., a dozen staff members, investigators who now carried her husband's name on their business cards. Every wall in her office bore reminders of why it existed. Photographs of families who'd lost soldiers, letters from whistleblowers thanking her for protection, framed commendations from the Department of Defense. But the frame that mattered most sat on her desk, Miguel in uniform, eyes full of quiet defiance. Some mornings she would look at that photo and whisper, "We're still doing it, love." And sometimes she wondered if he'd tell her she was doing too much or not enough. Outside her window, the city hummed with traffic, indifferent and alive. Inside, Sarah was preparing for another meeting, this time with a senator's aide who promised to back a new federal program for accountability in defense contracts. It was progress, she told herself. Slow, frustrating, necessary progress. But progress came with shadows. Anonymous threats still arrived every few months, short emails, unsigned letters, the digital ghosts of people who'd lost money or power to her husband's truth. They never scared her anymore, but they reminded her that corruption doesn't die, it adapts. She had learned to live with that, the same way soldiers learn to live with the sound of distant thunder long after they've left the field. That evening, the Foundation held its first Remembrance Gala, a formal event at a converted hangar near the base. Strings of white lights draped from the rafters, uniforms mixed with evening dresses, and photographs of fallen service members lined the walls like a living memorial. Sarah stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a poise that still felt borrowed. When the speeches began, she stepped onto the stage. The microphone crackled, and hundreds of faces turned toward her, officers, families, veterans, politicians. She took a breath. When I was handed a folded flag, I thought that was the end of my story. But sometimes endings are disguised beginnings. My husband taught me that integrity isn't a medal you wear. It's a decision you make every day, especially when no one is watching. The hall was silent. Even the cameras stopped moving. This foundation isn't built on tragedy. It's built on trust, on the idea that the truth, once spoken, doesn't belong to the powerful anymore. It belongs to everyone willing to carry it forward. She paused, eyes glistening. Miguel carried it. Now we do. Applause rolled through the hangar, not loud or wild, just steady, like rain on metal. From the back of the crowd, Agent Rebecca Walsh clapped the hardest. She'd recovered, earned a promotion, and joined the Foundation's advisory board. When Sarah stepped down, Walsh hugged her tightly. "You still make half the room cry," she said, smiling. Sarah laughed softly. "If they're crying, they're listening." Later that night, after the guests had gone and the lights dimmed, Sarah walked alone across the empty hangar. The echo of her heels mingled with the faint hum of the heaters. She stopped beneath one of the banners, a quote Miguel had once scribbled in a letter. "Truth is heavier than armor, but it saves you just the same." She whispered, "You'd hate all this attention," and smiled. But she also knew he'd be proud quietly, stubbornly proud. Her phone buzzed. A message from David Chen. "Need to see you. New development tomorrow, classified." Her stomach tightened. She had hoped the word classified was out of her life for good. But she replied anyway, "I'll be there." The next day they met in a small coffee shop outside the base. Neutral ground, no suits, no cameras. Chen looked older now, hair flecked with gray, eyes still sharp but tired. He slid a folder across the table. Inside were photos, weapons shipments intercepted overseas. The crates bore American serial numbers. Sarah frowned. "I thought all the networks were shut down." "They were," Chen said, "but corruption doesn't vanish. It relocates. Some of the same shell companies we froze have resurfaced under new names." Sarah leaned back, the weight of inevitability pressing on her chest. "So it starts again." "Not entirely," he said. "This time, we have people watching your people. 2 of the leads came from your Foundation's hotline." That surprised her. "So the system works." "Because you built it," Chen said. Then his expression softened. "But you can't fight every war, Sarah. You deserve a life too." She smiled faintly. "I have one. It just happens to be inconvenient for criminals." He chuckled, still quoting him. "Always." They talked for hours about reforms, about Walsh's new unit, about the families the Foundation had helped. When they finally stood to leave, Chen hesitated. "You know," he said, "for a long time I thought Miguel's story ended the night he died. But it didn't. You've kept it alive better than any of us could have." Sarah shook her head. "I didn't keep it alive. He did. I just refused to let it be buried." That night she drove to the mountains, the same road she and Miguel had once taken on lazy weekends when the world felt simple. Snow lined the edges of the asphalt, catching the moonlight. She parked at an overlook that faced the valley, where Fort Carson's lights flickered faintly below. The cold bit at her cheeks as she stepped out. She carried a thermos of coffee, the same brand Miguel used to drink, and poured a little onto the ground. "For you," she said softly. The wind carried her words away, but she imagined they reached him anyway. In the quiet, she reflected on the path that had brought her here, the letter, the danger, the losses, the victories. Each moment felt distant yet vivid, like echoes bouncing between mountains. For the first time, she realized she wasn't haunted anymore. She was anchored. Months passed. The foundation expanded, working with Congress to create an independent oversight committee. Sarah traveled often, speaking at military academies, meeting families, mentoring young soldiers' spouses who had lost their partners. One of them was a woman named Leila Parker, whose husband had died in a training accident clouded by missing equipment reports. Sarah met her at a small cafe near the base, where Leila confessed, "I don't know how to keep going. Everyone tells me to move on. I don't even know what that means." Sarah reached across the table, taking her hand gently. "Moving on doesn't mean forgetting," she said. "It means carrying them differently." Leila wiped her eyes. "How did you do it?" Sarah smiled faintly. "I didn't. I still don't. Some days I just remember why he mattered more than the pain." That conversation became the foundation's motto, "Carry them differently." Soon it appeared on brochures, banners, even plaques at counseling centers across the country. In quieter moments, Sarah learned to live again. She rebuilt friendships, adopted a rescue dog that followed her everywhere, even started painting, something she and Miguel had joked about back when they were young and broke. Her paintings were simple, mountain skylines, rifles turned into silhouettes of trees, coffee tins beside folded flags. They weren't about sadness, they were about continuity. One evening, she attended the opening of a new veterans center that bore Miguel's name. As the ribbon fell, she saw families smiling, kids playing, soldiers laughing over free coffee. For the first time, she understood what legacy really meant. Not memory carved in stone, but lives still unfolding because of it. Agent Walsh found her in the crowd afterward. "You look peaceful," Walsh said. "Maybe I finally am." Walsh nodded. "It suits you." Back home that night, Sarah sat on her porch, the dog asleep at her feet. The stars stretched endlessly above the Rockies. She thought of all the names written in the files, all the ones never known, and of one man who had refused to be silent. She whispered, "I think we did it, Miguel. I think we finally stopped the bleeding." The wind answered in soft whispers through the pines. She closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash over her. For years she had carried his voice in her head, that quiet insistence that right and wrong weren't gray, just hard. Now that voice no longer hurt. It guided. And beneath it, another truth lived, the one she had learned herself. Courage doesn't always look like standing tall. Sometimes it's just staying true, even when no one salutes you for it. Weeks later, she received an invitation from the Pentagon. A new initiative, internal integrity training for officers, would include her story as a case study. They wanted her to speak at the launch. Sarah stood at the podium in a hall filled with uniforms and medals. She began quietly, letting the silence build. "My husband once said the military isn't just a force, it's a promise. Every weapon, every mission, every uniform carries that promise. And promises break when truth is treated like a casualty." Dozens of heads bowed. A few faces showed tears they didn't bother to hide. He kept that promise, so did the agents who stood with him. "The least I can do is keep it alive." When the applause ended, she looked out at the rows of soldiers, young, determined, unscarred by betrayal. And she felt something she hadn't felt since before Miguel left for his last deployment. Hope. Later that night, she returned to Fort Carson's museum. The curator had added a new piece beside Miguel's rifle, a quote engraved in brass. "Integrity is the courage to act when silence is safer." Sarah Martinez. She smiled, not pride recognition. She traced the words with her fingertips, whispered, "Thank you for teaching me how to fight the second kind of war." The rifle gleamed beneath the soft lights, and in its reflection she saw both of them, Miguel and herself, standing side by side, unarmed but undefeated. Sometimes victory isn't about winning. It's about continuing. It started with a dream. Miguel was sitting on their old porch, the one with the broken step he always swore he'd fix. He wasn't in uniform, just jeans, boots, that faded shirt she loved. He smiled at her like nothing had happened. And then, as the light dimmed around him, he said only one thing. "You can stop fighting now." She woke with tears on her pillow and the dog nudging her hand, the night air cold against her skin. For a long time she just sat there, staring at the dark outline of the mountains beyond the window. Maybe the war inside her really was ending. Maybe she just didn't know how to live without it. In the weeks that followed, Sarah slowed down. The foundation was running itself. Walsh managed operations. Chen oversaw investigations remotely. Her calendar, once packed from sunrise to midnight, had spaces again. Empty hours that used to feel like peace now felt like questions. When people asked how she was doing, she smiled, said the right words. But alone, she found herself drifting back to old habits, rereading Miguel's letters, visiting the rifle in the museum, walking the same trails they once hiked together. Not out of grief anymore, out of habit. Like a soldier still tracing the shape of a scar long after it's healed. One evening, she met Walsh for dinner. The younger woman noticed instantly. "You're tired," she said. Sarah shrugged, maybe just recalibrating. Recalibrating, Walsh grinned. "That's your word for thinking too much." They both laughed, but Sarah's eyes wandered to the window, to the lights of Fort Carson glowing in the distance. "Sometimes," she said softly, "I wonder if I became addicted to fighting. Every time I stop, it feels like I'm betraying him." Walsh's smile faded. "You're not betraying him, Sarah. You're living for him. There's a difference." Sarah looked down at her coffee. "I know, but living feels harder." A few days later, an email arrived from the Pentagon's Office of Oversight, the very program she'd helped create. They were inviting her to join as a senior advisor. Full clearance, long-term position, influence at the highest levels. It should have felt like triumph. Instead, she stared at the screen for nearly an hour before closing the laptop. That night she drove again, no destination, just the comfort of headlights cutting through dark roads. She ended up at a small roadside memorial she'd never seen before. A wooden cross, a few dog tags, a faded photo of two soldiers. No names, just a note. "We tried to make it right." She stood there for a while, the cold wind tugging at her hair, the stars endless above her. It felt like the kind of silence Miguel used to find peace in, the kind that didn't need fixing. A week later, Chen called. "Still considering the Pentagon offer?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Feels like another battlefield." He was quiet for a moment. "Maybe it is, but at least it's one you get to choose." She smiled at that. "You sound like him." "Guess he left a few things behind in all of us." His tone changed, softer. "Sarah, I'm being reassigned Overseas Oversight Task Force. It's temporary, but it means I won't be stateside for a while." "Be careful," she said. He chuckled. "You too." When the call ended, she sat in silence. Everyone was moving forward. Chen, Walsh, even the foundation. And she was standing in the middle of her own story, unsure whether to turn the page or close the book. Spring came to Colorado like a slow exhale. Snow melted from the peaks. Wildflowers began dotting the valleys. Sarah started volunteering at the Veterans Center bearing Miguel's name, tutoring kids, organizing therapy sessions, painting new murals for the walls. One afternoon, a young soldier approached her after a class. He was quiet, shy, his uniform crisp and new. "Ma'am," he said, "my dad served under Sergeant Martinez. He talked about him all the time." Sarah smiled gently. "Your dad was in Alpha Company." "Yes, ma'am. He said your husband saved their lives in Kandahar. He never forgot that." He hesitated before continuing. "He also said that doing the right thing cost your family everything." The words hit her like a slow, dull ache. "Sometimes it does," she said softly, "but that's why it matters." The young man nodded, eyes wide with respect. "I just wanted to say thank you." When he walked away, Sarah stood alone in the sunlit hallway, heart heavy and full at once. It was the first time she realized how far Miguel's shadow reached, not as darkness, but as shelter. Later that month, she finally accepted the Pentagon position on her terms. Part-time advisory only, no politics, no speeches. She would guide, not govern. Watch, not control. Her first day back in Washington felt surreal, the marble corridors, the smell of polished wood, the quiet power in every step. But as she walked through the security checkpoint, a soldier saluted her. Not because of rank, because of recognition. She nodded back, humbled. Inside, she saw her name on a door. Sarah Martinez, Senior Civilian Advisor, Integrity Oversight Division. Underneath it, someone had pinned a small note. No signature, just two words, "For Miguel." Over the next months, Sarah learned to balance two worlds, the institution she once distrusted and the foundation she had built from its ashes. She trained young analysts, mentored officers, reviewed policies, and sat in rooms where truth finally had a seat at the table. And slowly, something inside her shifted. One night, after a long session, she walked out onto the Pentagon courtyard. The city lights glittered across the river. She stood there, feeling the wind on her face, the same wind that once carried dust through combat zones, now carrying the scent of cherry blossoms. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was fighting ghosts. She was building something they could rest in. But fate has a way of testing even the healed. It happened during a closed-door briefing, a new arms contract flagged by her department. Everything looked legitimate, except for one small discrepancy: a supplier address in South America that matched one from Miguel's old case files. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. She leaned forward, studying the papers. "Where did you get this vendor?" The young analyst hesitated. "It came pre-approved from Logistics Command, ma'am. They said it was clean." She tapped the folder. "It's not. Check cross-reference file 407A. You'll find it under Iron Veil." The room went silent. Minutes later, confirmation came back, same shell company, same offshore routing, just renamed. A ghost from the past, resurrected. She exhaled slowly. Even now, even after everything, the rot found a way back in. After the meeting, she sat alone in her office, staring at the file. She could feel Miguel's presence beside her, not haunting, just reminding. Integrity wasn't something you achieve once. It's something you defend every day. She picked up her phone and called Chen. He answered from what sounded like an airport. "You saw it too, huh?" "Yes," she said. "They're trying again." "I'll handle the overseas end," he promised. "You handle DC this time. We don't chase them, we corner them." Sarah smiled. "Deal." When she hung up, she looked out the window. The city lights blurred against the glass, and for the first time she didn't feel exhaustion. She felt resolve. The war hadn't returned. It had never ended, not really. But she was no longer fighting it for him. She was fighting it with him. Weeks later, the operation succeeded, quiet, efficient, without headlines. The corrupt line shut down before it grew roots. The report was classified, but those who knew understood. They called it Echo Resolve. For Sarah, it wasn't another victory, it was balance. Proof that vigilance mattered, even in peace. At the Foundation's anniversary dinner, Walsh raised a glass. To the woman who taught us that silence can be broken gracefully. Laughter rippled through the room. Sarah smiled, eyes warm but distant. She wasn't the widow who had grabbed her husband's rifle anymore. She was something steadier. A keeper of promises. That night, after everyone left, she walked the empty hall of the Foundation building. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch her: Miguel, Rodriguez, Morrison, Chen. Each one a story of endurance. She stopped before the main plaque, where a single inscription glowed under soft light. Integrity outlives power. Her reflection stared back, older now, lined but unbroken. She whispered, "You were right, Miguel, the fight never ends, but maybe it's not supposed to." She smiled through a breath that felt like release. Outside, the night stretched wide and clear. A faint wind rustled the flags above the base, and for a heartbeat, she thought she heard a familiar voice carried within it. "Then keep going, love, just keep going." She turned toward the sound, eyes shining in the darkness, and whispered back, "I will." Sometimes, the bravest thing isn't picking up the rifle again. It's putting it down and still standing watch. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. And somewhere beyond the silence, Sarah knew. The promise had been kept. It was morning again. Golden light spilling over the Rockies, the air crisp enough to taste. Sarah stood on her porch with a mug of coffee warming her hands. The dog, older now, gray around the muzzle, lay beside her, watching the sun rise. The world looked calm, and that in itself felt miraculous. It had been nearly 10 years since the day she'd opened Miguel's rifle stock and found the truth hidden inside. 10 years since a folded letter turned a quiet widow into a storm that reshaped a system. Now the foundation she built ran without her. Walsh led it with precision and fire. Chen had retired after decades of service and sent postcards from the coast every Christmas. The Pentagon program she advised had become mandatory training, the Martinez model of integrity. The war that began with one man's silence had turned into a movement. And somehow, without realizing when it happened, Sarah had become its last living keeper. She spent her mornings writing now, not policy or testimony, but small, handwritten letters. Not to officials, not to journalists, to herself, to Miguel, to the people she'd lost along the way. Sometimes she'd read them aloud, softly, as though the wind might carry them where voices couldn't reach. "You were right, love. The truth doesn't fade, it ripples, even when no one's left to see it." Her voice trembled, but not from sadness, from awe. From the quiet wonder of survival. That spring, the Army invited her to Fort Carson once more. They were renaming a wing of the Veterans Center, the Martinez Hall of Honor. She almost declined. Ceremonies had never been her thing. But Walsh called, her voice bright as ever. "You don't get to skip this one, ma'am. You built it." So she went. The base hadn't changed much, the same fences, the same hum of distant drills, the same sky that stretched forever. But walking those grounds now, she felt something different, not ghosts, not memories. Continuity. A young officer greeted her at the entrance, barely 30, nervous but proud. "Ma'am," he said, "it's an honor. We've studied your case in ethics training. Sergeant Martinez's courage, its legend around here." Sarah smiled. "He tell you not to believe everything they print." The officer laughed. "Maybe, but it changed the way we do things." And that, she realized, was enough. Inside, the ceremony was simple. A flag folded, a plaque unveiled, a few words spoken that carried the weight of decades. General Morrison, now long retired, walking with a cane, was there too. When their eyes met, time seemed to fold in on itself. Morrison smiled. You made it, Sarah. You too, Sarah replied. The old general leaned closer. You know, when I think about that day in the hospital when you could barely sit up but still asked for the files, I realize something. You didn't just survive it, you redefined it. Sarah blinked back tears. I just didn't want him forgotten. Morrison shook her head. You did more than that. You made sure none of us could forget what truth costs or why it's worth it. When they unveiled the plaque, Sarah expected the usual inscription, dates, medals, official phrasing. But instead, it bore only a single line. He told the truth, and she carried it. Beneath it, both their names. Miguel and Sarah Martinez. Her hand trembled as she touched the engraving. For the first time in years, she didn't feel the sharp sting of loss. Only completion. She stepped back, and the crowd rose in applause, not loud but steady, like the heartbeat of something enduring. That night, long after the ceremony, Sarah lingered on base. She walked the empty corridors, the faint hum of lights echoing like distant memories. She found herself, as she always did, in the museum. The same rifle. The same plaque. But now there was something new beside it, a photograph of her and Miguel, laughing in a kitchen, mid-conversation, unaware the picture was being taken. She remembered that day, a burned dinner, a broken plate, and Miguel saying, "If we can survive my cooking, we can survive anything." She smiled. Guess we did. Her reflection shimmered in the glass, layered over the rifle's steel. It felt symbolic, as if their lives had fused into one continuous story. His truth, her courage, their legacy. The next morning, Sarah drove out to the old overlook, the place where she'd once poured coffee into the snow. It was spring now, green replacing white, the air alive with the sound of distant streams. She sat on the hood of her truck, the dog beside her, watching the sunrise. The sky bled from gold to pink to the deep blue of memory. She took a folded envelope from her pocket, the last one she'd written. She read it aloud softly. Miguel, I used to think grief was a wound. Now I know it's a seed. It grows into whatever you water it with. I watered mine with purpose, and it grew into something neither of us could have imagined. You gave me truth, I gave it a voice. And the world, in its small, imperfect way, listened. She smiled faintly. You told me once that courage isn't loud. You were right. It's the quiet that keeps showing up, day after day, long after the noise fades. She folded the letter again, tucking it into the old coffee tin she'd kept all these years. Then, gently, she buried it under a flat stone at the edge of the overlook. A marker. Not for loss, for continuation. Later that afternoon, back home, she found a small package on her porch. No return address. Inside, a photograph, one she'd never seen before. It showed Rodriguez, Walsh, Chen, and Miguel standing outside a hangar years ago. 4 soldiers laughing, unaware someone had snapped a picture. Behind it, a note in Chen's handwriting. Thought this belonged with you. The good ones never really leave. Sarah pressed the photo to her chest, closed her eyes. For a long while she just stood there, letting the silence settle around her like sunlight. Then she framed it, hung it above her desk, next to Miguel's flag and the Foundation's first certificate. And beneath it, she placed a small brass plate engraved with a single word. Endured. Time moved forward. Seasons changed. New faces took her place in meetings and ceremonies. And yet, whenever someone mentioned integrity in the armed forces, her name still followed, not as legend, but as lesson. Every year, on the anniversary of Operation Iron Veil, the Foundation hosted a memorial run. Families, soldiers, civilians, hundreds gathered to honor those who had fallen. Sarah attended when she could, walking the route instead of running, her dog trotting faithfully beside her. And though her hair had turned silver, Her eyes still carried that same quiet fire, the one that once made generals listen and corrupt men fall silent. One evening, as the sun dipped low behind the peaks, Walsh came to visit. She brought coffee, old photos, and her usual unfiltered honesty. "You ever think about retiring?" she asked. Sarah laughed softly. "I thought I did. Turns out purpose doesn't come with a pension." Walsh grinned. "You sound like a recruitment poster." "Maybe I am," Sarah said, looking toward the mountains. "But not for soldiers, for truth." They sat in silence for a while, the way old friends can, no need for filler, no need for words. Finally Walsh said, "You know he'd be proud." Sarah smiled. "He already is." That night, long after Walsh had gone, Sarah stood on her porch again. The stars stretched across the sky like a map of everything she'd lost and found. She thought of all the faces: Miguel, Chen, Rodriguez, Morrison, the young soldier at the Veterans Center, and realized something simple and profound. She wasn't living after them. She was living with them. They were part of her still, in every act of courage, in every quiet refusal to give in. She whispered into the night, "Rest easy, love, I'll keep watch from here." And in the rustle of the pines, in the whisper of the wind, came an echo she'd known for a decade. "Always, Sarah." The next morning the sun rose as it always did, soft, golden, unapologetic. Sarah poured her coffee, fed the dog, and smiled at the world outside her window. There were no letters to read, no enemies to face, no medals to hold. Just the steady hum of life continuing. And that, she realized, was victory. Not the kind with banners or applause, but the kind that breathes quietly through every day you choose to keep going. Because in the end, Miguel had been right. Courage isn't loud. Integrity doesn't shout. And dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.